Hello and welcome to the Jewish Heretics podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order. We are a progressive Canadian Jewish organization that's been around since the 1920s. My name is David Wall, and I am the community's cultural director, and I'll also be your host today. For this, the 23rd episode of our podcast, I had the honor of speaking to the amazing Cherien Dabis. Cherien is a Palestinian-American actress, director, producer, and screenwriter. She was named one of Variety magazine's 10 Directors to Watch in 2009. In 2022, she was nominated for an Emmy Award in the category of Outstanding Directing for a comedy series for her work on the television series Only Murders in the Building. You know, the one with Steve Martin and Martin Short. In March 2022, Dabis was named Laureate for Cultural Excellence by the Takrim Foundation for her work on authentic Arab representation in Hollywood. Over the years, she has written for popular television series, including The L Word. She has directed episodes of Rami, starring the comedian Rami Youssef, Ozark, and The Sinner. Recently, she's acted in the acclaimed Netflix series Mo, featuring Palestinian-American comedian Mo Amer. Cherien has written and directed 3 feature films, the most recent being All That's Left of You, which premiered at Sundance Film Fest in 2025 and was the Jordanian entry for Best International Film at the Academy Awards. It made the shortlist in December. Our interview is recorded on January 15th, 2026, in advance of screenings of All That's Left of You across Canada, including a January 23rd screening in Winnipeg and a January 30th screening at the Toronto International Film Festival Lightbox in Toronto. Here's our conversation. Cherien Dabis, thanks so much for taking the time out to be in our podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Very happy to be here. How are you?
I'm well, although we had a kind of snow apocalypse in Toronto last night.
Oh,
I
wow.
couldn't open the front door because of the snow piled up. And
Wow,
you're currently on tour promoting your amazing feature
I
film.
am.
Where are
Yeah.
you right now? Where are you calling from?
I'm actually back in New York. It's one of those rare moments where I get to be home.
Oh, wow, that's
Few
great.
days here and there, I get to, get to kind of stop back at home, do my laundry, unpack, repack, that kind of thing.
Amazing. But you've been on a sort of rock and roll tour, a whirlwind rock and roll tour promoting your
I
film.
have. Yeah, it's been amazing. It's been really just a gift.
Yeah, I bet. I'm going to jump right in and sort of step back a little bit before we talk about the film.
Hmm.
On this podcast, we like to talk to activists and we like to talk about origin stories, as in
Love it.
when did you come to your political consciousness? What shaped your
Hmm.
identity?
Hmm.
You were born in Nebraska, grew up in Ohio, which from
That's
our
right.
perspective it's sort of almost, this is like cliched heartland America, middle America. Did you grow up,
Absolutely.
did you grow up with a sense of your Palestinian roots and all the injustices that were at play in that identity?
I did. I very much did. My father is from the West Bank and he was exiled from Palestine in 1967. So, like the characters in my film, he had to get foreign citizenship just to return to visit his family and the only home he'd ever known. So
Mm.
I grew up with his heartache over his exile. I grew up, with the news on every single day in our household, constantly just, looking at what was happening back home, talking to relatives, going, with my dad, and, my dad taking us all on visits to see his family in the West Bank. So I saw him harassed and humiliated at checkpoints. So he very much, grew up, even though I kind of was born and raised in the Midwest, I grew up visiting Palestine and getting these windows into occupation and being very aware of my identity, and it was a kind of a slow dawning, you could say. It was, certain events in my life that really made me more and more viscerally aware of what it meant to be Palestinian.
Right. You had, I heard you in an interview talking about something that happened when you were 8 years old, trying to get
Hmm.
into Palestine. Can you talk about that moment? Because it seems sort of formative.
Yeah, it's my first memory of traveling to Palestine, actually. My family was traveling from Jordan into the West Bank via the Allenby border crossing, which is where Palestinians have to cross. And we were held by Israeli soldiers for 12 hours. They interrogated my parents again and again. They, kind of picked through all of the contents of our suitcases. And then they ordered all of us to be strip searched, including my baby sisters who were aged 3 and 1.
Goodness.
And so, obviously at that point, my dad was, just confused, really upset. He confronted the soldiers and they started yelling at him and he started yelling back at them. And so that was really a moment for me. It was like the first time in my life where I really saw my dad as powerless and extremely vulnerable. I mean, it was a moment where I didn't know whether he was going to be killed in front of us or not.
Mm, mm,
And I just remember thinking when we finally made it through, when, we were finally allowed into, you know, Palestine, into the West Bank, I just remember thinking, oh, this is what everyone's talking about. This is what it means to be Palestinian. And to my 8-year-old mind, it just kind of meant like, whoa, they really don't like us. Like, I don't like, I wonder why. Like,
mm.
and I also remember really thinking, like, we must be like, they're misunderstanding who we are. It's like this really visceral feeling of being deeply, deeply misunderstood.
Right. You also talk about later on in your life being kind of radicalized, if that's the right word, by your experience as a Palestinian-American during the Gulf War. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and I mean, radicalized is an interesting word. I think in this context, I would move away from it and maybe say something more like, I was really awakened politically. Like I was made so aware of who I was, especially in this country, in the US. So it was essentially, I was 13, 14 years old. It was the first Gulf War. And despite the fact that my family had lived in this small town in Ohio with, all of our friends and neighbors and all of the residents of this town for a decade, people turned on us overnight. I mean, they went from friends and neighbors to, thinking we were the enemy overnight.
Mm,
And it was really shocking, I have to say. My dad is a pediatrician and he was really beloved. He was known for saving the lives of babies and children in this town. And so, I was used to walking around and being like, people coming up to me and saying, "Your dad saved my son's life or my daughter's life." And that was always a really beautiful thing. And suddenly my dad was a threat to people. We
mm.
got death threats on a daily basis in our mailbox, love it or leave it. We'll get Saddam and we'll get you too.
Incredible.
My dad lost a lot of his patients. People came into his office, asked for their medical records and left. And the Secret Service came to my high school, if you can believe this, to investigate a rumor that my older sister, my 17-year-old sister, threatened to kill the president.
My goodness.
So this was the level of like really kind of insane racism that we were experiencing at that moment. And as a freshman in high school, I was just so shocked by this sudden shift. And I became really obsessed with why this was happening. Like really this question of why.
Mm,
Like why do people suddenly believe these horrible things about us? Why do they suddenly believe that we're a threat? Like what convinced them that this was even possible? And when I really investigated, what kind of dawned on me over time, and I started to really see it, was that we were being so dangerously misrepresented in the media, in film and television, that these horrific stereotypes about us were actually effective, that people were believing the things that they were seeing and hearing in film, television, and media. And that was really a huge shift for me. That was
right.
a moment, and I would say it was a political shift as well as just a shift towards activating me as an activist. The political shift was one where I realized that I would never be fully American, that I would never be accepted as fully American. And what that did was allowed me to embrace who I really was, that I'm this hyphenate, Palestinian, Jordanian American, that, my roots are, I have deep roots in the Arab world, in Palestine and Jordan, where my family is, where my, so much of my experiences lie, where my ancestors and family story are. And the US is also a part of who I am, but I had to kind of learn to embrace this sort of double identity, so
Right.
to speak. And then on the activist side, I think that was the moment where I became really motivated. And motivated isn't even a strong enough word, to be honest, just really, really committed to changing the narrative, to really putting authentic portrayals of who we are out into the world, to tell people, like really to show people who we really are. Because at that point, I was like, oh my God, people are actually believing
Right.
these horrible lies.
It's interesting. I used the word radicalized before, but I should have said motivated. I
Mhm.
meant that you were sort of
Right.
turned on to a new political consciousness. And it's
Absolutely.
interesting. Your activism, uh, it's inspirational. Your activism is expressed through art, which is a
Mhm.
perfect segue into talking about your film. Which I patted myself on the back. I just love the title of your film because, of course,
Thank you.
it's a double meaning.
Right.
All that has left you, all that you've lost, but also all that is left to you. I thought I was a bit of a genius of course, it's obvious to everyone except me, but I just love that title. One of the things that makes the film so remarkable, I found it profound and moving and just really brilliantly done. And of course,
Thank you.
it's a bit nauseating because you wrote it and you directed it and you star in it. Uh, but one of the things that makes the film so remarkable is that it's perhaps one of the only portrayals I've seen of Nakba era Palestine.
Hmm.
Um, and it really carries a feeling of authenticity in its attention to detail, its art direction, down to the props, down to the buses driving by. Can you describe the process you went through to make this a reality? And did you feel almost a special responsibility to get it right?
Oh boy, did I. Did I ever? It's funny because as a Palestinian who grew up in the US, I was always aware that people didn't really know anything about Palestine. I mean, in the 80s in Ohio, people didn't know where Palestine was, let alone who the Palestinians were, like what was happening, quote, over there. I was constantly asked, what do you think about what's happening over there?
Mm.
And I I had always wanted to make a Nakba film in a sense. I was really aware growing up that people didn't know what happened to us. People didn't know how we became refugees. They didn't know what happened to Palestinians in 1948 or in 1967 or in, any of these other kind of significant, historic years. And when I embarked on the beginning of, making this film, I felt just a tremendous amount of responsibility, which is why I really took my time in the development of the story. Before I even sat down to start writing it, I took 5 years just to think about it, to
Goodness, yeah.
develop the characters, to think about the structure. How did I want to tell the story? It's such a vast story. And I knew it was going to be multi-generational because the Nekben never ended. So how was I going to approach this multi-generational family story? And I really spent time, I immersed myself in books and, different periods of Palestinian history. And when I started gathering my crew, I mean, it was really beautiful because I managed to surround myself by people who were just absolutely remarkable. I mean, craftspeople, artists, and people who really gave their hearts and souls to this film. I mean, they were so excited about telling a Nakba story, about depicting different periods of Palestinian history that we've never before seen in cinema. And they also felt a tremendous responsibility, and so they were in the weeds with me. We were just really in the details, thinking, this is really the first Nekba film to make it to kind of make it to this point. And we wanted it to come, to get to this point where it's like we're on, on screens all over the world. And this is an ongoing Nekba film as well. So we were just really in the details, looking at archival footage, looking at all of the photographs from the different time periods that we could get our hands on, just really inspecting every detail of these photographs and this footage, looking at, what people wore and what the inside of their homes looked like. And, if we couldn't find the props, then we built the props. And so I give so much credit to my phenomenal crew. I had so many people in Palestine who just gave so much
Mm,
and
mm.
worked so hard to get the details right because we all knew that it was really important, and we wanted to make the most authentic a depiction of these different time periods as possible.
Yeah, it's really one of the many wonderful things about the film. I urge people to see the film for multiple reasons, but just the look of it is astounding. I
Mm.
I want to I
Thank
want to talk
you.
about balance. I really
Mhm.
think you've achieved a perfect mix of in the film of on the one hand this grand, sweeping, epic cinematic landscape. This
Mhm.
universe, the film tells a story in a sense of Palestine over many decades, but you also focus on interiority of character, the heartbreaking experience of really a handful of people who have been
Mhm.
traumatized by this history. And it's a
Mm.
hard balance to get right, and I think you did it masterfully. Can you discuss? You did mention, you sort of alluded to the multi-generational or the multi-decade aspect of the film. Can you talk about some of these choices you made? For example, was it your intention for the beginning of your creative journey to follow one family over four time periods? Why did you make this choice rather than, for example, concentrating on the events in and around 1948, which could have been a film unto itself?
Yeah, absolutely. It was my intention from the beginning to tell a multi-generational story. And you could say that, that's in part because I was inspired by the different generations of my own family. And what I really wanted to look at in this film was the impact of the Nakba, the impact of the ongoing Nakba on the Palestinian people. Like really how, like the kind of legacy of trauma, the legacy of collective trauma that we all have because of the Nakba. And so that was one of the things I was really thinking about from the beginning, really wanting to look at the political events through an emotional lens and really seeing how they kind of change people, how they shape our identities over time, and they change the fates of entire families.
Mm,
And so, I was looking at the generations of my own family from my grandfather to my father to my siblings and I, and how we were shaped by the ongoing events in Palestine, how we all had different opinions about what had happened, what was happening, what should happen. And I just found that fascinating. How we all had very different reactions and different levels of trauma and different reactions to the trauma. And so for me, the film was always deeply emotional. Like again, as someone who grew up in the West, surrounded by news headlines that were constantly dehumanizing us and kind of just relegating us to nothing but numbers and statistics. And I felt what's missing, what people don't understand is the emotional impact, is like really the emotional experience of what it is to be Palestinian, to survive and endure all of this. And I thought if people could just understand that, like that emotional, the toll that it's taking on human beings, then maybe that could help bring some understanding to what's happening in Palestine. So that was really my motivation from the beginning. And I would say that, the way I was thinking about it was, okay, there's the macro, right? There's the historic and political events that people may or may not know. And even if we know them, maybe we know them, kind of just intellectually, we know them to a certain degree. But we don't necessarily know the impact that they had and continue to have until today. And so that was really what I wanted to focus on, was the micro, was like, how are people changed by the macro, by the historic? How does history impact people? And so I kind of thought about it in these two layers. And I thought, all right, the macro is the epic and the sweeping, the historical events, the things that we're seeing. But I really wanted to keep those things in the background because I really wanted the focus, the foreground to be this family.
mm,
And, therefore really seeing how the family has changed. And so I wasn't sure at the beginning how many time periods. I think relatively early on, though, I kind of found the first image of the film. Very often the way I the way I think about stories or the way I know that I have a film is that an image comes to me very, very strongly. And once I have that image, the image evokes so many questions for me that I begin to think, oh, this is it. This is the story. This is my way in. So it's usually an image towards the beginning of the film. And the image for me in this case was the protest. It was a teenage boy at a protest during the first Intifada. And in a way, it's an iconic image because it's an image I certainly grew up with it. I grew up watching it in Western media and seeing it on the news and and many other people like have seen this image of, teenagers, young boys and men at protests in Palestine. But we don't very often like really get to know like who these boys are. Who are these teenage boys who are willing to put themselves in harm's way? Why are they at this protest? Why is there a confrontation with the Palestinians and the army to begin with? Do we even know that the army is invading their refugee camp? Do we know how their families ended up in the refugee camp? And so once I kind of thought about this image of a teenager at a protest and like a moment of violence, and we don't necessarily know what happens to the teenage boy, but then we cut to the face of an old woman. This was the series of images that I got. And I thought, oh, okay, this is it. I'm going to tell the story of how this boy ended up at this protest
Mm.
and how he ended up in front of, these bullets that are flying. And I want to tell the story of this moment of violence. But to tell the story, I really have to tell the story of his grandfather and how the family ended up in the refugee camp that's currently being invaded by the Israeli army. And that was it for me. That was like the moment that I knew I had the film. And that from there, the entire structure of the film unfolded. And I
Hmm.
began thinking of it really as a movie about the consequences of violence. It's not a violent film. I chose my moments of violence very carefully. And each time period has a moment of violence, and they're not all necessarily physical moments of violence. There's psychological violence, there's administrative violence. The different kinds of violence that we experience, that Palestinians experience under occupation. But those moments of violence really show then how people are changed. And so I began thinking about it as like, how is the family changed by
Hmm.
this moment,
Hmm.
in 1948? And then in the 1970s, when we see a father humiliated in front of his young son, and their relationship is never the same again. So we see the consequence of that humiliation, the consequence of that violence. And then again in 1988, where we see that moment of violence at the protest. And then we see some, administrative violence and bureaucracy that comes later as well in that time period. And that for me was the way I balanced the kind of macro and the micro, the sort of big sweeping quality of the film,
Yes.
along with the really intimate, quality where I really kind of look at relationships and how people change.
During the third of the four time periods that you explored in the film, the one during the Intifada, um, what I see as the emotional core of the narrative takes place. I don't want to give too much
Hmm.
away, but the protagonist couple portrayed by you and the amazing Salah Bakri, they're presented with a stunning ethical conundrum.
Hmm.
And to help the characters come to a decision, they visit an imam and he gives them some advice.
That's right.
And he says, quote, "Your humanity is also resistance. It's the one thing no one can take away from you," unquote. It
Hmm.
seems in some ways that, to me anyway, that this is the central thesis of the film. Can you elaborate on this?
Well, one of the things I really wanted to do in this film is show, different reactions to occupation and also show the different ways in which Palestinians resist. I wanted to honor Palestinian humanity because I think that Palestinians do resist through nonviolent means, through incredible kindness and generosity and humanity. I think Palestinians have shown incredible humanity in the last 80 years, but the world doesn't really get to see that. And it's such a travesty to me because I think, again, I go back to my 8-year-old self, just thinking, my God, we're so deeply misunderstood. But it's more than that. We're so tragically misrepresented. There have been so many kind of lies that have been put out about us that sadly people believe. And so with this film, I wanted to really honor Palestinian humanity and really show that's like how often Palestinians have chosen humanity over other types of resistance. Um, and so that's one of the things that that we see in this film. And I wanted, in a way, that I wanted, kind of, I sort of felt like the world needs this message right now. Like we all need to be resisting through our humanity. We all need to be remembering our humanity right now.
Hmm.
We're moving into a more and more polarized world where it's just so easy in so many ways to allow, politicians to exploit our differences for their own profit. And here we are all kind of, thinking in these nationalistic terms, but at the end of the day, like a heart is a heart. We're all like human beings. And if we're so mired in our own pain and suffering that we can't see the pain and suffering of another, or we can't see how we're perpetuating or causing the pain and suffering of another, then we're part of the problem. We are perpetuating an increasingly violent world through that worldview, through that perspective. And I think it really begins with each and every one of us looking into our own hearts to see what's there, to see what biases we may have, to see what we may have learned that's not serving us. And I want people to take that away from this film. I want them to really be questioning their own humanity. Am I leading with my humanity? Like what can I do better? What is it that I need to learn? Because I really feel like there's no way that we can expect to have peace in our world if we're not at least trying to nurture peace in our own hearts. And, I think these systems of oppression thrive on instilling us with, anger and hatred. And I feel like, if we allow that, then we allow these systems of oppression to win. And that's why it's so important right now, more than ever before, that we really don't, that we don't go down that road and that we choose humanity over everything.
Hmm. Humanity is your resistance, but also this film is resistance. Yes, your artistic expression is a form of resistance, or at least I see it that way.
I think so. Absolutely. I think it's a form of resistance from erasure, from all of this, decades of misrepresentation, and memory. Absolutely. And ultimately, this is a movie about love. I really see it as a film about kind of the extraordinary will that it takes to survive um, personal loss and political turmoil, but also like the love that it takes to survive these things.
Mm.
And at the end of the day, all that's left of you is really about love. Like what's left of us when we've survived these types of tragedies is love. Like that's what gets us through it. And I think resisting through love is absolutely beautiful. I mean, you could say that's easy for me to say from a position of privilege, but that is my perspective. It's from this place. And in some ways, I think that anyone with privilege, all of us with privilege, it's our responsibility, because we have the ability to look at our trauma. We have the ability to attempt to heal. We're not in harm's way. And so it is our responsibility in some ways to try to lead with love. And that should be our resistance. That I think that absolutely is a form of resistance.
Um, as much as I'd like to talk to you for the rest of the day, I think that you need to. I think that I've been told by the powers that be that you have another interview coming up. So we'll leave it there. That's a beautiful sentiment to end on. And thanks for the gift of your film. It's magnificent.
Thank you so much.
And all power to you. And good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It was great to talk to you.
Yeah, you as well. Have a great day.
Thank you, David. You too.
Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank you all for listening, and we'd like to thank everyone who made the podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin, Stephanie Palumbo, and of course, our guest, Cherien Dabis. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. My name's David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.